Okay, we're back. Sorry for the delay. Okay, so we're going to jump straight into this afternoon. We have two speakers, and then we're going to have some time to have some more audience participation, ask some questions, just really get a bit messy at the end, I think. So first of all is Philippe Morel, and he's going to talk about computation as mind of the money, and money as the currency of the thought. And he is an architect and a theorist. And over to you, Philippe. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. I would like to thank Vera, you, and all the other people who organized this event for the kind invitation. So it's really a pleasure to be here. So actually I will discuss about a couple of recent hypotheses I made regarding the importance of technological change, and most of all the one associated with the production of money, actually. So I'm an architect. I assume most of you know that. But in a sense, as many other architects, I'm not only interested in architecture, and let's say more and more I'm less and less interested in architecture. It's becoming a bit of a boring profession, boring job.
It's all about architectural students.
But still, it's a way to look at the world, as Aldo Rossi stated in the past, and I still believe it's really true. I will go very quickly on a couple of introductory elements. So in architecture, I was interested into the pioneers, mostly the pioneers of the 60s, trying to deal with the issue of computation, and not really a style of let's say computational architecture, but something which was more about the underlying concept of computation. Nicolas Negroponte was a pioneer about that. Cédric Price as well, with his generator project, was also a very interesting pioneer. And also John Fraser with an evolutionary architecture. John Fraser was derived from the, let's say, the English school of let's say, digital literate researcher in architecture like Gordon Pask and some other people. I was also very much, apart from architecture, and by the way, I had the chance to meet with Anne-Françoise Schmidt at the end of the 90s, taking class of philosophy at the University of Nanterre. And I was interested in different philosophical trends, mostly epistemology, also in the philosophy of language. Very much interested in Wittgenstein and all this school of thought. I mean the Viennese school, mainly. And when I came to architecture, I wanted to put all of this into one go. I had different interests, but I wanted to articulate all of this. I went first into software, traditional software like this, but I was a bit sick of all the black boxes, all these functions, all these icons. Most of the students, I was still a student of course, most of the students, they don't know what these icons are really meaning. They just look at the result, but they don't really understand why it's happening. And I had too much of foundational interest to be happy with this. So I moved to Mathematica, which was mentioned yesterday by Ludger. And I worked on different projects. more or less conceptual, like this one at the Centre Pompidou for stage set design for a famous exhibition in 2003-2004, organized by Frédéric Miguero at the Centre Pompidou at that time. I went more and more into the relationship between architecture and mathematics, always trying to deal with some, let's say, arithmetic or geometrical aspect, it depended, of architecture. So we kept doing research with diverse mathematical methods, those one making use of genetic algorithms in order to produce objects like chairs. I mean, it could have been anything. I mean, chair is just a kind of iconic object to work with. So we kept working on that until recently, looking for, let's say, something which might be almost universal. I'm very much interested in this idea of the universal, which in fact, I mean, we have to make a distinction between the universal, the generic, and some other concept which might be extremely modernist. But I will come back to this topic later. So searching for also different notational strategies, for example, rather than devising an architectural construction with plans, sections, etc., we can deal with architectural construction as a set of relationship, as a network, taking inspiration from computer science and some sort of notation existing in computer science, and reaching a kind of very, very simple and very abstract architecture, which I call universal architecture, in fact, which again is slightly different from the modernist reference to the universal grid, etc. And I will show you that. So then, keeping working on that, we looked for how to make all of this nice principle concrete, how to deal with that on a structural level, etc., etc. And of course, there is always some sort of materiality in architecture. We cannot avoid that, either with stone, steel, extremely light construction with cables, etc., etc. So there is always this idea, and I'm very much in architecture interested in these examples, which are trying to address at the same time the concept of structure, materialities, and shape, in a sense. I mean, forms. I was never really interested into architecture which are not integrated, in a sense. For me, it should be one object, and I mean, that's what I'm interested in architecture. So we did different experiences making use of novel techniques like 3D printing. First with sand in Germany, like this, producing molds from different pieces, allowing different outputs. So you will see an extremely light concrete structure, I mean a prototype of concrete structure that we see here. And after that, in order to push the work further, I created a company which is called X3, which is a startup company dealing with 3D printing that we see here. So we see how it works. So it's really about 3D printing concrete. So basically, it's very simple conceptually. It's a well-known technique, but what's important is to make it operational and to get interesting results. So this is, I believe, what we managed to do in the recent time, in the past months, with different prototypes, a small pavilion here that we see at the Dassault Systèmes campus in Paris, next to Paris, in Vélizy, and also a structural column which was 3D printed and put in place in Aix-en-Provence, in the south of France, which was a kind of, a premiere, being a fully structural, complex geometry 3D printed component. So this is what we produced in the last year, because it's only 1 year old, this company, and in the last couple of months. So this is the last small prototype, which is now that we can see at the Centre Pompidou in an exhibition. But the other part of my work is far more theoretical, and it's based on this, let's say, constat. How do we say constat in English? Sorry? Un constat. Comment dire un constat? Yeah, a statement or
Finding.
Like a finding.
Yeah, like a finding. So it's based on this statement by Andrea Manzi, saying that the legacy of the 20th century, its dogmas and its principles of ethics are obsolete and useless. The 21st century presents itself with totally original and contradictory features which need to be reflected upon in an exploratory way without attempting to recreate a new orthodoxy, but rather a rarefied system of anarchic hypothesis and experimentation, more akin to an era like ours, experimental and anarchic. I really believe in that. I mean, I really believe in the lack of order, in the necessity to go toward experimentation, anarchistic hypotheses, etc. But when we deal with contemporary architecture, and especially when we deal with algorithmic hypothesis, in a sense, I mean, about the algo world, let's speak that way, we see a tendency to go back to this modernist grand vision. I mean, big data is supposed to solve everything, artificial intelligence is supposed to solve everything, etc. And I really disagree with that, and I'm looking for different strategies to deal with computation, but to escape almost the super deterministic underlying principle which are behind some of the big data approaches, at least on a philosophical level. So I'm taking distance, of course, with past hypotheses from people like Ren Koolhaas, which is very obvious here when he speaks about fundamentals. I definitely don't share the same kind of fundamentals as he's putting in front of us. I definitely don't care about walls, ceilings, toilets and balcony, obviously. I much prefer to address things on a larger scale, looking at the contradiction of the 20th century, especially this very interesting critical work at the end of the 20th century. For example, with the destruction of these very famous buildings in Pretago. And also, I spend a lot of time studying the new ways of working, the issue of autonomy in cars, in industry, and trying to find an alternative to this new idealistic, let's say, tendency in contemporary architecture, which is represented by Pier Vittorio Aureli. Even if I deeply appreciate Pier Vittorio and his drive for architectural theory, I don't believe in the kind of autonomy he's putting in front of us. I believe that the autonomy we experience today is completely different. In a sense, it's almost religious in its sense, and far more articulated than just a kind of Marxist autonomy, which is let's say the statements of Pier Vittorio. And what is extremely strange is that we can experience this kind of scene in Paris, but at the same time, those people, they want to customize their dress, their shoes, and things like that. So this is what I'm interested in. But the problem is that how we came to this new situation. Obviously, we came to that through the great invention of 20th century science, especially thanks to people like Shannon with the mathematical theory of communication. And in the year 48, what was quite interesting is that my favorite book in architectural theory by Siegfried Gideon, Mechanization Takes Command, was published exactly at the same time as the three most fundamental books in computer science and technology, 48. But one is about the analog, and the other one, obviously, are about the digital. And the digital took over, it's clear, even if it started with very unimpressive stuff. And this kind of stuff, by the way, which is very experimental, demonstrate how important it is, because those scientists got Nobel Prize for this crappy system on the left, which is one of the most beautiful and fundamental invention in history of science, which is the first transistor. Just keep in mind that the amount of transistor which was produced from the invention of the transistor until today is larger than the total amount of atoms in the whole universe. So when we think of that, it's just like extremely puzzling. So the perspective change, we deal with highly different concepts, but ultimately we go back to some very fundamental aspects which are energy on one side, and on the other side a mechanistic approach and theory of machine. I mean, Jacques Stern, who was leading the Department of Computer Science at the École Normale Supérieure, defines computation as the mechanization of abstraction. So we don't lose the concept of mechanization, but we just re-articulate it in a completely different way. I mean, but in fact, this trend toward abstraction was already present, because obviously the theory of machines by people like Franz Rollo were already a search for the abstraction of the mechanism. So we were already, let's say, on the right path. Looking at the art and the intellectual trends, we have all this in the 20th century. We have the accelerationism in 21st century. But for me, all this is part of rationalism. I believe that what we experience today has nothing to do with that. We are definitely in a post-rational era. We should not consider computation as something which is part of rationalism, because it's so radical that it's destroying rationalism. it goes beyond rationalism and it opens a completely new world and it creates completely new sets of values, in a sense. And one of the aspects of that is in rationalism, not everything was about mathematics. Obviously, and it was mentioned yesterday, the language of nature is written in mathematical character, as Galileo said, but still we didn't have mathematics just like everywhere. Now it seems that we have mathematics everywhere, that it's completely unlimited, and this is really coming also along with this idea of the universal. So not the universal as something which is on a moral level, but the universal as something which has to be directly operational, directly effective. So it's two completely different worlds. On one side, the universal of rationalism is philosophical, is moral, while the universal of computationalism is mathematical, effective, and technological. It should work, actually. It should, we should be able to put this in a machine, otherwise we are not interested in universal anymore. So we don't, this concept of universal has completely different values if it's considered through the eye of rationalism or through the eyes of computationalism. So I pass on this element because it was already addressed by others. Another important concept is the one of simulation, and this one thanks to Franck Varenne, who was also studying with Anne-Françoise. Thanks to Franck Varenne, we now have very, very interesting work on the philosophy of simulation in France, and is now being translated in English, so very soon this very important work. I personally consider Franck Varenne as one of the most brilliant young generation epistemologists in France, probably the next Bruno Latour. I'm saying this because Bruno Latour is extremely fashionable, but I believe that Franck Varenne is even more talented than Bruno Latour. So, and what's interesting when we read Varenne is that he says that simulation is more and more using multiple mathematical formalisms that coexist in a non-mathematical way, ideas which are not reducible to a same and unique axiomatic. Simulation is neither a discourse nor a language because of the heterogeneity of its conceptual tools. So this is very important because modernity is associated with axiomatic, with the axiomatics in a sense, and it's still present in many ways. When I speak about the universal, for example, I don't speak about the universal as something which has to deal with modernist, idealist concept or with the axiomatics of the modern world. I'm speaking and I am interested in the universal more in the sense of the universal Turing machine as something which always works, in a sense. Something which does not care about the context. You can make use of a universal Turing machine in order to do biology, finance, medicines, physics, etc. It's literature, art, architecture. So I'm interested in this kind of universal, and this universal is not an axiomatics. It's not a reductionist approach. It's something which is, by the way, so strange when we think of it that it's philosophically very difficult to address. I know Anne-Françoise also, and she started obviously much before me, but addressing this through the concept of the generic, of the genericity. It's still something which is philosophically not fully well understood again, because when we think of the universal Turing machine, it's the most universal machine which ever existed. Maybe only the will and the electricity. Electricity is an energy, it's not a machine, obviously, but maybe the concept of will and electricity are comparable to the universality of the Turing machine. But still, we still don't completely grasp this extreme power of computation. And I remember in my master thesis, I said that what's very puzzling with computation is that you have the feeling that you put together the power of the steam engine, the power of modern physics, the power of the nuclear explosion, all together in one object, which again is very very challenging in a sense to address. So simulation is also dealing with pure computational power, being able to solve billions of equations with billions of unknowns in a couple of minutes. This would have taken billions and billions and billions of years, let's say even 50 years ago. Now we can do that in 2 minutes, which is just crazy. And we enter, obviously, this world of the big data. But when we look at the impact of this technology, because we are experiencing this in a capitalist world, we go back to the one of the most important universal, which was considered by Marx, the ultimate universal, which is money. Money, we can today associate money with computation. We can have almost a perfect equality between a state in a finite state machine and money. The Bitcoin, obviously, is telling about that in a very obvious way. There is a bit and a coin. In a sense, we already see this equality between money and computation. But what I consider more and more now is that every state in a finite state machines, and obviously we have billions of billions of billions of billions of states at every second almost in the world. Every state now can be associated with a certain quantity of money, which makes money move from the world of the finite, let's say, to the world of the infinite. If we look historically at money in history, if we look at this coin, for example, which is called the solidus, the Roman coin, and by the way, even the word solidus means that it's solid. It was called by the historian Roberto Lopez the dollar of the Roman age, of the antiquity. If we look at this money, it was obviously very stable. Then with Bretton Woods, what's the English? Accord. Process with the Bretton Woods system, which was set. Obviously, we enter we started to enter a different world. But I'm not interested in money in itself. I'm interested in money as an exponential process. Because I'm interested in money today as a way to make a critique, of the traditional left-wing hypothesis, which I consider amazingly idealistic in a sense, which is so amazingly obvious here. If you read Rosa Luxemburg, she devised the collapse of capitalism because of a supposedly lack of raw material. I mean, capitalism will collapse because there won't be enough steel, minerals, enough gold, enough food, enough whatever, enough oil. We now have this hypothesis. We read many traditional left-wing critics of capitalism saying that capitalism will collapse because we don't have oil anymore, or we won't have enough oil, etc., etc. I totally disagree with that, and I love this quote from a layman in Texas. Who has oil in his garden, by the way. But when we asked him about the end of the petroleum age, he said, it's not an issue. He said, I will find another way to make money, which is perfectly right, in fact. So, this guy is just smarter than Rosa Luxemburg when we think of it. So, it's true that the Stone Age never collapsed because of a lack of stone, and it's not going to happen with anything in our society. So, what's important today with the issue of money is that we had gold at a certain time, which is a rare material, and by the way, it's recycled. Gold is recycled. We don't find that much new gold mines, actually. We fundamentally make use of the old gold. So if some have rings in gold, it's probably coming from old money, even maybe from the Roman people. We don't know it, but there is probably a small part of it which comes from very ancient money. And so we are moving from the bonded society, a bonded capitalism state, which was still the modernist world, to a contemporary world which is truly postmodern, which is the world of the infinite. I believe that this move from the finitude towards the infinite is probably one of the most fundamental, let's say, philosophical, how should I call that, fact today. And it's very true with the derivatives. If you look at the amount of derivative product now in the world, it's kind of amazing. If you look at the quantity of gold which was in circulation in the history, you see that it remains fundamentally equal because we recycle the minerals. But if we look at the money at the moment, we have in 2010, so this is a Federal Reserve source. In 2000, we had about 178 billions of US dollar in circulations in the world. But we had, and it's 700 millions, 700,000 billions of derivative product circulating around in 2011. So what we see is that the discrepancy between the amount of money which is circulating and the amount of derivative product, the amount of financial product which is constantly exchanged, increase in a completely exponential way, actually. And this leads to, the quantity of gold which exists in the world is not that big. You can put all the gold, all the reserve of the world in a stadium, actually. But we have a new, what I call a fundamental law of capitalism and materialism, which is an inverse. For example, the more you dig into the material, the more value you can create. So if we speak about nanotechnologies, we can consider that it's opening a way of giga capitalism, in a sense. If you trade at the scale of a nanosecond, obviously you will be able to produce much more financial product, or at least to trade much more financial product than if you deal at the scale of the hour, for example. And the more you reduce this scale, the more radical capitalism becomes, in fact. And this is what I consider as a very fundamental aspect of our contemporary society. So in the world of standard data and standard money, you have rationalism and classical capitalism. In the world of big data, big science, and electronic money, we experience the world of computationalism and integral capitalism. This was theorized by Thomas Watson. It's not a very famous writing, also because it's not that easily accessible. But this writing by Thomas Watson is quite fascinating because it's showing, for not the first time, but one of the very first time, is showing how the speed of the exchange is important for capitalism. So it's directly proposing a new statement saying what matters today is not the production of goods, it is only the speed at which we will trade values, actually. And if we deal with those values at extremely high speed, then we will have a competitive advantage. Even in the 90s, when we look at theories dealing with postmodernity, it's still very cultural. We look at Jameson, the famous Jameson book. The subtitle is The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. In fact, we definitely have now a computational logic of capitalism. Some people like McLuhan understood this as well. McLuhan, who said that the computer is the LSD of the business world. It's a very simple and very beautiful sentence, like always with McLuhan. And when we look at the trading floor, we see how McLuhan statement is true, actually. The computer accelerated trading and the exchange of goods, not only abstract values, but any kind of commodities around us in an amazingly fast way. So we have now this high frequency trading. It's becoming such a big business that we have a complete hardware industry which is entirely dedicated to that. So if you want to be really efficient, you don't use your personal computer, you buy specific CPUs for that, and obviously we have this. But now I'm coming to the almost philosophical thesis about that. When we look at the deep equivalence between money and computation, so between, let's say, a state in a finite state machine and let's say 1 billionth of a dollar or whatever, it can be an electronic money like Bitcoin or whatever. And it's sure that electronic money will come. It's unavoidable. There is no way to avoid at some point having a universal money. I mean, we have a universal measure for time. It's a second, which is very precisely defined as a wavelength of, I don't remember exactly the metal, but it's a wavelength of the vibration of a metal, actually. We have a whole system of universal units, but when we look at the money, it's still amazingly archaic, actually, because there's no universal. I mean, it's very basic. I mean, the concept of it is universal, but just imagine that you go in China and they have a different definition of the second. You go in the US and they have a different definition of the second, etc. I mean, in a completely integrated and globalized world, for sure, local monies won't exist anymore because it will become too complex to deal with. So the Bitcoin might definitely be the ultimate money, in fact. And it will happen. I mean, the name is not that important, but it will happen for sure. But when we look at this equivalence between computation and money, which ultimately is an equivalence between a certain mathematical sequence and money, we see how patterns are important. What's important is to find patterns in things, and this relates to what was presented by Eli Agashi this morning when he devised about the regularity of numbers of patterns in different bit array sequences, actually. So when we look at that, we see different strategies in order to analyze this pattern. But when we read scientific paper now dealing with computation, they say that the machine is in the pattern. So we know that the money is in the machine because we make money thanks to the computer. We know that more and more the machine is in the pattern. This is what scientists who are working on alternative computing techniques, like for example making use of cellular automata to do computation, etc. This is the way they conceptually describe what they are doing. They are using patterns in order to make machines. So now we see that the money is in the pattern. And when we look at the reality of trading, we see that these patterns are more and more important. That's the key element. But, and this is quite puzzling, with the big data, and there was a recent paper by Giuseppe Longo and Christian Calut about that. When the big data, we can have any correlations whatsoever, and one of the reasons for that, and it goes against this idea by Chris Anderson in June 2008. Chris Anderson wrote a provocative essay titled "The End of Theory." The data deluge makes the scientific method obsolete. And obviously, Longo is against that. Longo says that with enough data, we can have anything. So this is what he says here. The idea behind this new philosophy is that sufficiently powerful algorithms can now explore huge databases and can find their own correlation and regularities, independently of any analysis of meaning or content of such correlation, which are notions very difficult to define. Rules for prediction and possibly for action are then provided by the machines. The strength and generality of this method relies on the immense size of the database. The larger the data, the more powerful and effective is the method grounded on computationally discovered correlations. And Longo and Caliud are making a critique of that. They are showing mathematically that with enough data, you can derive anything. For example, here you can have a spurious correlation between the people who were drowned after falling out of a fishing boat, correlating with the marriage rate in Kentucky. And it's not by chance that we have that, and this is what Giuseppe Longo insists on. It's not by chance, because if you look at the theory, and this is the question they ask, making use of Ramsey theory. Ramsey, who was close to Wittgenstein, by the way. Are there binary or finite strings with no patterns or correlations? And the answer is no, actually.
Why?
Finite. And the answer is no if we consider finite sets. And the question is more precise here. How many elements of some structure must there be to guarantee that a given regularity holds? Ramsey theory answers the first question in the negative by providing a precise answer to the second. Significantly, Graham and Spencer subtitled their scientific American presentation of Ramsey's theory with the following sentence: complete disorder is an impossibility. Every large set of numbers, points or objects necessarily contains a highly regular pattern. So, philosophically, my question is related to that. Let's consider that everything has a pattern. And let's consider that computers, thanks to neural network approaches, thanks to artificial intelligence, thanks to genetic algorithm and different kinds of non-classical algorithmic techniques, and obviously thanks to the computational power, let's imagine that you can find any pattern, you can detect any pattern whatsoever, even the smallest one, everywhere. Let's make an experience of thought, a thought experiment, and addressing the possibility for computers to do pattern matching on the whole existing context. Then, if the money is in the pattern, it means that you can transform anything, anywhere, into money, which opens the way to this, what I call natural capitalism, or or should I even say supernatural capitalism, because natural capitalism is a bit too close to Adam Smith, you know, it's a bit too ideological, while my capitalism is post-ideological. It's a mix between let's say mathematical sciences and natural sciences. So we can have this hypothesis that there will be no limit in capitalism, and one of the reasons for that is because we have this complete superposition of computation and money through the concept of pattern and pattern matching. And this is why most industries are investing, and obviously Eli Hayashi knows that much better than me, but this is why you see also an exponential spending in advanced technologies for trading, because it seems that the stock exchange and the amount of money which is now generated just follows the Moore law. In fact, I mean, we have no difference now between the Moore law and the computer and what we have on the stock exchange. Just to show you the let's say the very fine precision of the concept which are used. Even some scientific they don't make use of FPGA chips actually, because it's very expensive, etc. So if you look at Deutsche Bank hardware solution, this is what you read. Whereas most latency trading solutions are built in software, Deutsche Bank solutions is based upon a field programmable gate array in which blocks of logics are programmed into a chip. The trade comes into the card. The card does the protocol translation and risk checks. We are bypassing the PC and doing everything in hardware, which is again which goes against this not against, but which goes again toward this idea of a complete identification and equality between physics through the concept of computation, thanks to logics, and money. So it's pure natural capitalism. Natural in the most fundamental sense that it is physical. You see what I mean. And if you look then also on another level, at the level of knowledge, here are two different approaches. Similarly, if X involves PhD level math and takes 50 milliseconds to compute a trading decision that would make a 50% profit on execution, but Y involves only high school math and only make a 5% profit, but only take 5 milliseconds to compute a decision, Y is very likely to outperform X. In this sense, then, a clever algorithm can be beaten by a less clever one if the less clever one is faster. So, one way in which this desire for speed manifests itself is in the use of rapid, accurately approximating, so the quick and dirty, stochastic machine learning techniques as alternative to statistically rigorous analytic methods. The analytic methods are exact, but require the computationally expensive manipulation of vast matrices. The approximations are inexact, but computationally cheap and hence fast. And this is, epistemologically speaking, it's also the difference between the modern world of axiomatic, where things are to be pure, analytical, well written, etc., and the postmodern world of simulations, in the sense of Frank Barrel, which is made of heteroclite and heterogeneous mathematical beings, some of them being extremely quick and dirty, but extremely efficient. So we are definitely in a completely different, to use Foucauldian words, in a completely different regime of, of meaning, and it's a completely different episteme in a sense, because the universality of the modern world was the universality of something which was reductionist. It was the universality of the axiomatic logics and arithmetics as well. Obviously, before Gödel shown that all that was not that simple. But the universality of the postmodern era, which is ours, is the universality of the effective and efficient things. And this started, by the way, and Kolmogorov was mentioned, and it's true that at the very beginning of 20th century we had those two important work, the one of Bachelier, who was the true founder of financial mathematics, in a sense, and the one by Kolmogorov. And in his thesis, Bachelier said that the determination of the movement depends on an infinite number of parameters. It is impossible to hope the mathematical prevision, the mathematical expectation, the exact mathematical expectation. Contradictory opinions related to variations are shared, are so well shared that at the same time the buyer believes that value can increase, and the sellers that values can decrease. The calcul des probabilités, so probability calculus, is that right? Probability calculus will probably never be applicable to the movement and to the dynamic, and to this movement and the dynamics of the stock exchange will probably never be an exact science. But it is still possible to study mathematically the static state of the market at an instant time, actually. So to establish a probability law of variations of the values, which that market can consider at that instant. If the market does not predict the movement, it still considers them more or less plausible or probable. And this probability can be addressed mathematically. And this is what happens now, coupled obviously to advanced work, for example, dealing with geography. This map is quite amazing. It was produced in 2010. It's showing the best place in order to do trading in the world, because we believe that the internet is destroying the concept of place, but it's really the other way around. it's not destroying the concept of place, because the magnetic field on the surface of Earth is not homogeneous, and according to the place where you are, you can lose a couple of milliseconds in the sending of a signal. So a physicist at MIT and Harvard, they recently produced this map showing that in some perfectly, in the middle of nowhere, in the Indian Ocean, next to Madagascar, is probably a very nice place to do to install a new stock exchange and to make money. So, if I make a comparison with Siegfried Gideon I mentioned before, another famous book by Gideon was Space, Time and Architecture, which was very idealistic and modern. And now we just have space, time and money, because you see that we know exactly, not only in time but in space, when we should sell and buy stuff. So I pass on this because it's not that important, and I'm running a bit out of time. So one of my let's say statement and is how should we deal this? This is something which is on the web. I don't know who invented this beautiful word, by the way, the nihilionism. But anyway, if we deal now with the society in a very pragmatic way, one of the issues is that how can we deal with a certain kind of egalitarian society while on one side we have the people or the bank industry, the finance industry, who can transform any movement whatsoever in money, because it's a pattern, and as long as it becomes a pattern, you can make money with it. And the one who have absolutely no mathematical tools, no infrastructure, and who are, let's say, leftovers of this society. So some hypotheses are universal basic income, which are not completely devoid of weak points, actually weak aspect. But another one is to readdress the issue of randomness. This issue was recently addressed, and again it started from Kolmogorov. So Per Martin-Löf was a student of Kolmogorov. He got his PhD with Kolmogorov. So at the same time, Per Martin-Löf and Grigory Shaitin came up with the idea of algorithmic incompressibility. Per Martin-Löf added a layer of logics, and that is a great logician, and he added a layer of logic. But in any case, and this almost goes back to this famous definition by Cournot during the mid-19th century. Cournot said that le hasard est la rencontre de deux séries causales indépendantes. So randomness is the encounter of two independent, obviously fully independent, causal series. And when they meet, you obtain a true randomness. It makes us think of Lautréamont on a literary level. But what I'm interested in with this issue is that if you have pattern, if you can recognize pattern, in fact, you go towards this, you open the path towards this infinite capital. It's becoming so radical that I have to say that I'm not even sure I am against it or in favor of it. I don't think that there is any left-wing politics which is seriously dealing with the radicality of this phenomenon, of this phenomenon actually. But if I look at algorithms, because the topic of this seminar is about algorithmic sovereignty.
Spectral sovereignty.
Yes, spectral
Not
sovereignty.
algorithmic.
Yeah, but there is the algorithmic dimension, obviously, in it. And if you look at the algorithmic incompressibility, you have a very precise algorithmic theory. For the first time, a mathematically precise definition of randomness, which was not the case neither with Cournot or also with von Mises, which was presented a little before. And so we now have a very good definition of randomness. And we can make use of this definition of randomness, we can make use of this algorithmic theory of randomness in order to go towards something which is almost a kind of anti-algorithmic theory, or at least an anti-reductionist approach and a radical critique of the algo world, in fact. Because when we look at those things, in fact, these people didn't lose the game against AlphaGo, making use of DeepMind and deep learning technique. He didn't lose because he used the wrong strategy. He has lost simply because he made use of a strategy. And the computational power of the machine was so superior to his own computational power that any strategy, and a strategy means a pattern in your movement, any strategy was understood beforehand by the machine before the next move, actually. So this guy, if I would have played Go instead of that guy, because I absolutely don't know how to play, I probably would have achieved a better result. Because I wouldn't have been able to make use of any strategy, so my behavior would have been completely random, chaotic, and maybe the computer would have thought that I was just, it couldn't identify a logic in my movement, something that maybe a quantum random generator would have produced, something that you can predict with a deterministic approach. So it's not a pseudo-random randomness. It's a true randomness. You cannot compress it with algorithms. So I come up ultimately with something which is, and I show you as it, which completely reverse. By the way, this is an image of the Earth, not the Moon, which completely reverse the way we look at things. Because traditionally, traditionally we looked at things in a way which was quite classic in a philosophical sense. We used to consider randomness as something unfair, as something which was the law of nature, and hence le droit positif, the positive law in English probably, is totally opposed to the law of nature. It's not the droit naturel. I mean, there is a strong opposition between the droit naturel and the droit positif, and the droit, le droit positif is definitely about making sure that we correct the unfairness of nature, in fact. So if you are born with a certain disease, we make sure that we will cure your disease, or that we will compensate by helping you with a certain amount of money or whatsoever. And this is changing, in fact. This is changing because when we look at what is happening today, and this is something I published last year, but it's almost a 2 years old work. It's a small essays I published in an Italian journal, and I made a comparison between Superstudio and the cities of today. So there was a Superstudio project which was called the 2,000-ton city. And my statement was the following. So perfectly uneven, cities lie scrambled amid continents and oceans. They are not really cities, but a mere accumulation of drifting elements, tens of millions ranging from the most luxurious houses and offices to the most elemental, decrepit, and insalubrious dwellings. Nevertheless, equality does exist, as most of these constructions are made of the same hazardous materials, whose annual production leads to the death of millions of inhabitants, from newborn babies to elderly people. A cold and patient holocaust and self-holocaust often from people, conscious but ignorant, or knowledgeable but unconscious. The few who are both unconscious and ignorant are usually in prison. In all of this, there is no noise and smoke, but rather a silent and highly profitable business, firstly for the innocent killing, then for the ecological problem-solving issue. Contrary to what used to happen within Superstudio's 2,000-ton cities supreme achievement, within the last Earth, all citizens are in a state of perfect inequality. Thanks to mathematics and computation, capitalism has transformed itself into nature. Money is not a problem anymore. Like scientific discoveries, it just grows up as exponentially as Moore's law. All you need is a bit of knowledge and a computer terminal, as well as a piece of land, only to make sure you won't be poisoned by street food. The market, in its integral state of perpetual motion, as perfect as ocean waves, goes up and down. Derivatives help transform every single movement into gains. Up is fine, but down is no less fine. If the market were to stay perfectly still, one could keep betting on its future movement and bet on the first bet ad infinitum, as long as you can compute it with a finite state machine. Money is mechanically produced by pattern recognition. Computer scientists say that the machine is in the pattern, and since we all know that the money is in the machine, ultimately the money is in the pattern. Therefore, any repetition of any kind invariably leads to a recognizable pattern, and as surely as the multitude watch TV, any pattern leads to money. Marx once said logic was the currency of the mind. We say computation is the mind of the currency. So what's my statement, in fact, when I said that we move from computation as a currency of the mind, of the money, sorry, to the money as a currency of thought, is that traditionally we have the tendency to make a separation between techniques, work, money, etc. as separate entities. Obviously, the gain in the capitalist societies were highly dependent, profit were highly dependent on labor force, on mechanical power, etc., etc. What I'm saying here is that this view, which allowed us to make clear distinction between different concepts, is not relevant anymore. We cannot anymore make a distinction again between the concept of money or the concept of added value or plus value or whatever, and for example the concept of computation. They are one and the same things. We consider capitalism as a deviation of nature. Now I consider that capitalism is becoming in itself more natural than probably anything else that existed before. And then I have the feeling that when you look at the concept of the market in Eli Hayashi philosophical work, the market is where everything happens. It's the beginning and the end of everything. It's not only true for the stock exchange, for the exchange of commodities and financial products, including derivative, but it might be true for the whole human actions, in a sense. And I more and more believe that it's time to enter, to leave the critique of capital based on the use of natural concept. I believe that it's time to, on the contrary, it's time to accept the perfect superposition of science through computation and mathematics, nature through physics, including quantum physics, and when we will have quantum computers, it will be even more obvious, actually, and capitalism. If we don't accept this superposition and we start a new critique from that, we have, there's no way to understand anything about the new sort of sovereignty and the way we behave today with this new situation, including the exclusion of data, etc.
Very exciting. Thank you so much. So, Rich, I have 1,000 questions, but I want to give the floor first to everyone else. I will come back to it. Who has something to ask?
Me, maybe?
Yeah, please.
Maybe from from my point of view, maybe the market is the first criticism of capitalism, because according to me, the market is not part of capitalism because precisely it makes the algorithmic project fail. Because my point is to say that, of course, for instance, Bachelier says that the market, the movement of the stock is completely unpredictable because there is an infinity of causes happening every second. And this is why it's true that algorithmic trading will never capture the thing, because in every millisecond there's an infinity of people wanting to buy and sell, etc. So that's randomness, I agree. However, the way I like to look at it, and again it's through derivatives and richness that they bring, is not at randomness actually, but at the event. In the sense that the event brings a whole shift in the worldview. So therefore, there is definitely one cause, not an infinity of causes. So it's not randomness. There is one cause that brings about the event, but that the event is unprecedented. So it's always, as Nassim Taleb has argued in the Black Swan, after the event that you work out the backward narrative in order to understand that that cause has brought the event. So in my sense, it really, I want to be to contrast the point of view as much as I can. I would say that no, the event is not randomness in the sense of Bachelier's an infinity of causes happening every second, which makes the noise of the stock exchange. So the event is caused definitely by a cause. However, I have no idea before it happens what the cause is, and it's always by a backward narrative. And it's not, it's logical because the cause was completely outside any scenarios that I have previously in my algorithm and even in my whole worldview. Okay, and so in this sense, the event is completely outside any computation ever.
Yes.
So there is no pattern at all because there is no that's completely unprecedented. And then I try to argue that the market, seen from the point of view of randomness of Bachelier, I completely agree with you, that is down to algorithmic trading, and therefore you can make money as soon as you detect the patterns. However, the event with the capital E, which brings about one thing that was not seen before, which has a specific cause, except that we don't know it beforehand, that kind of event is going to be dealt with by a superior entity, which is the market, in my sense, augmented with the derivative. And the reason how I could argue technically that this is so is that if you look at it step by step, every derivative that in my logic gets written and starts to be trading on its own is actually an unprecedented event vis-a-vis the situation that you had before. Because the situation that you had before, there was only one asset trading. So that in that small world that you had before, you had no idea that the event of trading the derivatives is what was going to happen. So that's why, to me, the derivatives is predicated on the fact that there are always unprecedented events and how I can link with that. And another aspect of what I try to say is that, on the contrary, because there is the possibility of losing huge amount of money in the market, and that's also going back to the point by Nassim Taleb, who says that no matter whether algorithmic trading has made fortunes for 5 years in a row, if the 6 years you lose everything that you had before, it means that the whole idea was wrong from the start. And so according to me, because there is in the market the possibility of losing money in huge amounts, that the market is actually the correct algorithm or correct computing engine to connect with the unprecedented event. So I'm trying to say this to say that I agree with you as long as randomness and pattern recognition, and I did ask you whether the strings were finite in your case,
yes.
and you said yes. So this I agree, and you have always a possibility of recognizing a pattern, but that maybe tells us that algorithmic trading will only work for such an amount of time, but
yes.
Who is going to be around to observe in the next year that the thing is going to collapse and the whole system is going to collapse? And to say that if I look at the other infinity that I like to think of, which is the future, in that case, no, it's not computable because it's always unprecedented events that happen.
But I agree about the fact that the truly unprecedented event is not computable.
Okay.
If we consider the event in its most radical sense,
Yes.
with capital E, it's a pure emergence.
Yeah.
It's something that can absolutely not be predicted. But what can be predicted, and in a sense, I have the feeling that it can even give birth to new derivative products, is that just imagine that there is one unprecedented event. Obviously, the way you will react to this event, I mean you, meaning you, any human or a machine or an algorithm, the way this actor will react to the event won't give us a lot of information.
Mm-hmm.
But just imagine that we have 1 million events with capital E, and 1 million unprecedented and unpredictable events. If in 60% of the case we react in a specific way to this unprecedented event, then we lose the characteristic of the true event and we transform, we derive, in a sense, we derive this unpredictable series of events into a recognizable pattern. And this is where the derivative is also so fascinating, because you can create financial product on everything, and it seems that there is no theoretical neither logical limits to the possibility of predicting things. Because if you cannot predict something, you can analyze at least the reaction to the appearance or to the advent of a set of unpredictable events. So you see what I mean. And recently I have read a paper on that. It was about the regulatory problems, how we should regulate the market and the use of algorithmic trading techniques. Is that a couple of scientists made a research precisely focused on the comparison on many days at I think it was at the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. They analyzed the pattern of action, and they tried to see if there are recognizable patterns according to the fact that the trading was done by algorithm or if the trading was done by humans. And they saw that when it's done by algorithm, you can have more you instantly have more repetitive patterns. But even, with the event being the same, because the amount of information was the same in the two cases, but when they analyze the behavior on many days, when they analyze the behavior of the market, they can perfectly identify when the order was traded by algorithm or if it was traded by human. So in a sense, the example I could take is quite simple. Just imagine I leave this glass fall on the ground. If I do this, let's say, one time everybody in the room might be surprised. So this is an event because nobody was waiting for that, and the way they react is also an event because they are surprised. If I do it 2 times, it's a bit less of an event already, even if considered individually. It's the same movement, it's the same event, but the very repetition of it already makes it less of an event. And if I do it 100 times, it will be so amazingly predictable that in the room nobody will care about that. They will say, "Oh, is this really?" so we the algorithm won't pay attention to this, but it will pay attention to the behavior in the room, and it will create a new derivative product according to this behavior in the room. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I have the feeling that because there's no limit in the way you can derivate things, you can, from step to step, step by step, you can move from something which is absolute contingency to something which transforms slightly, step by step, into recognizable patterns, which
Sure, can I answer, or maybe you want to ask?
You can click.
Yeah, sure. In that sense, I perfectly agree that the derivative is the completion of that framework of contingency or randomness up to that level, because the derivative completes the market, by the way. So as soon as you have something that you have recognized is random up to a certain degree, it's absolutely correct that if you write the derivative and then you evaluate it by the same pattern that the computer or our algorithms have recognized, you evaluate the derivative, and that's it. The derivative closes off the market and it becomes complete. However, my argument is to say that now that you've written that derivative, because you are encouraged by the patterns that you have recognized up to now the derivative is going to create an unprecedented event for you, in the sense that that event cannot be accountable, cannot be attainable in the level before, which is a new price, which is not redundant. So that's how derivatives, even though the theory to evaluate them is always one level below, and it's a theory where the derivatives basically are redundant because you are supposed to completely replicate them with other stuff, following the patterns that you have recognized. So that's correct until you write the derivative in true effect and it becomes a material contract that now is open to the market, and now my postulate applies, which then means that is going to create an event which is outside the context of the previous level, and therefore opens up until infinitum. So I'm always in excess of any degree of randomness and closure and algorithmic logic that I have identified up to now. And because in my thinking I believe that the concrete world is infinitely deep, as I said earlier, except that I want to project that forward, I need to go to infinity by saying, then let's imagine that all derivatives of all levels of complexity are created, actually or virtually, for me is the same. Then it means that no, there's no way any level of randomness is going to close on itself, and therefore we are always open to the unprecedented event with a capital E.
But as you said before, the amount of sequences which are not randomly distributed are in fact very tiny compared to the sequences which are completely equal.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yes.
Because I think what we are confusing is measuring and counting.
Sorry?
Measuring and counting.
Yes.
Because with probabilities, that's the strange thing. No, they are somehow not strictly separated. But we measure probabilities, but only through counting them. And I think what you are hinting at with this new proximity between money and between computers, I think it's not new at all, because you have with algebraic symbol, the general equivalent with regard to any number or unit notion. That means with regard to any multitude or magnitude. This is since since we have mathematical theory, it has been like that. So that's on the one side, and then with regard to the measuring side, that's what money does. No, money makes different measures which are incommensurable from a logical point of view, commensurable. That's what money does, and this is not new either. So what is new, what appears to us new now, is that somehow through computation, and through the theory, which in a way undoes this categorical distinction between what can be measured and what can be counted, and formulates it with a kind of a formalism that simply distinguishes between ordinal and cardinal numbers. So, and then you can exchange the relations. So what is measurable can become countable, and what is countable can become the role of the measurable as well. So they are not strictly separated anymore. And this is the way how we look through the Turing paradigm onto computability to the computer. And then we have this impression that the two converge, and that this is creating a kind of, however you want to look at it, an implosion of capital, or a revolution of it, or a new raising it to a new kind of level, a new kind of capacity. And I don't think this is, first of all, something which would be very specific for our time that we can observe. I think it has a lot to do with Baroque, with the empty axis in Baroque, where code and before the calculus was invented, which allowed a new kind of geometry within these infinitesimalities, you had a similar kind of a collapse with regards to when you say it doesn't matter whether virtual or actual. So I would say this is Baroque. That's exactly Baroque. So we're not going through that for the first time. That's what I want to suggest. And apart from that, I cannot make points anymore. So that's my fundamental. So this is my fundamental critique to all you told many lies, many stories, and I was very fond of a lot of them, and of this going in this direction. But I would question everyone from exactly that point of view. So money and algebra, they're not new. They have always been doing the same.
It's really, I mean, as it was said by Hermann Broch in the introduction of the Sleepwalkers. Hermann Broch said that the two modern instruments of our time originated at the Renaissance. The abstraction of money through accounting, and the asceticism of money through the through the reformist church. So it's true that it started at the Renaissance. It's not completely new to have an identification of let's say accounting and capitalism and money, or arithmetic and money.
No, but that's my point. Algebra and money, not arithmetic. Arithmetic is numbers. Algebra is the general equivalent. Money is not an amount. So if you say with arithmetic, then you are tying money back to a gold standard. So there is a relative.
It started.
My point is with algebra, not arithmetic.
It started with arithmetic, then it obviously became algebra. But what I mean is that now it's neither arithmetic nor algebra. It's a state in a finite state machine.
It's cryptography, which is algebraic. It's not so the point, the perspective with which I would like to challenge yours, no, is when we say okay, money is the general equivalent. So it doesn't have a correspondence. It's not a reference to a finite amount of resources or an original amount of worth or whatever you want to think. So it's a general equivalent. It allows for fluidity and for transformability. if this is money, then we can set it always in parallel to the technologies of different times. And then we don't have to say in Renaissance there was with the paper money and the briefings, or I don't know, for briefen in German, I don't know what the word is in English. So when you give guarantees, that then your colleagues will cover for the money that you give. So that this is an abstraction of it. Of course it is, but it is an abstraction of it in the sense that it raises the capacity of what money can do as the general equivalent. It expands the realm of where the general equivalent can work to a novel scale, which is correspondent to the logistical new conditions of how infrastructures are being organized. So they always race together, and money needs to be able to do more. The more network and the more.
What I mean is that historically, there was a finite quantity of money, and we used mathematics in order to compute this quantity of money, and let's say more or less all its permutation or whatever.
That's the finite, but it was given.
It was a finite scenario because because the money was a finite resource, as long as it was based either on gold or on paper, which for long actually was backed by a gold equivalent, by the gold standard. So it was a finite world. What I mean is that now we reversed the scenario. We don't have mathematics, whatever it is, algebra, arithmetic, etc. I mean, for me, it's not an issue at all, because in a finite state machine, you don't care about those things. You just consider the state. So, and you don't, it doesn't matter how you reach that. Actually, by the way, you have many mathematical models which are used in the computer, but ultimately, it ends up as 0 and 1 and states. At least in a finite state machine, it ends up at states. So, but what I mean is that until the modern era, and more or less until the invention of the computer, we had a certain amount of money, and we made use, in a very utilitarian manner, we made use of mathematics in order to compute, to count, to do accounting, let's say, to deal with this amount of money, which was again finite. In a postmodern and computational world, it's completely the opposite. We have a quantity of computation which increases very rapidly thanks to the Moore law, actually, and money is something that we can apply.
Because you monetize all the states of the
Exactly,
system.
because we monetize all the state of the system, and it doesn't matter if the state of the... I mean, I can monetize my own mood, let's say. I can transform my own mood to now. I can transform it into a mathematical model, then into a computation. This computation means different...
Or a derivative.
Derivative. I can make a derivative product of myself and a derivative product of derivative products, etc., ad infinitum. I do that, and then I use the money, I apply, it's almost like a mapping in a mathematical sense, and then I apply the money, which does not exist, but I don't care. I create it conceptually, and then I apply the money on these different states. I mean, I don't know if you...
No, I totally agree.
I think it's so
money
different.
is fundamental, but it's more fundamental than time, even
Yes.
in the numbers.
Yeah. It's so different from what you described.
No,
in
you
the
misunderstand what I was
ancient
saying. What I'm saying is not the worth of money or the value of money. I'm saying money is a finite amount, that's true. And this is what is changing now. I agree, it was, and this is changing, I agree. But still, money was introduced first by some emperors to keep mobility within the market. So the money, a finite amount is sent out to circulate and to distribute and eventually come back with the taxes. So the finite amount of money had no corresponding thing. It was not the total amount of goods that people need to exist, and this is what I now give to everyone. It's a purely operation, it's an operator that allows fluidity in exchange. So, and this is changing today, I agree, in a certain sense, but what you have with the finite state is not this circular, it's not a process of partition that distributes and comes back, but with the finite state you are in linearity, you are in consequentiality, and you are in process. And with the networks of the money, which is distributed in order to come back and to afford circulation everywhere in between, we are in the circular, we are not in the linear.
State, we are not in a linearity, we are in a, not even in
That's
my
why you have the
computer.
decision problem.
No, not even in my
With this I don't agree. Okay.
If my computer have multiple core, as a CPU with multiple core, for example, I am already not in a complete state of linearity, but already in a parallelism approach.
Yeah.
So it's not because it's based on states that it's purely linear. At least in time. Ultimately, of course, you have the very, very beginning and the very, very end. So ultimately you can see that as something linear, but only
That's
partially.
different with money.
Only it's not different with money. It's local. Locally speaking, it's linear. But if you consider all the exchange through the world, it's absolutely not linear. It's non-linear.
But we should make a short coffee break and then
Continue.
and we make 10 minutes.
Yeah, is there any more questions at all in this point? We come back in.
Can I ask quickly?
Just one.
On the first part of your talk, you talk about the universal and about the computational universal that is not reductionist. And I would like to ask on that, if the universal is from the previous talk, maybe the market as a universal of reality, or if it's, which in your case you said is predictable, or if it's computable, and you said it's not, because there cannot be a model of that besides itself. Or if we can relate it to what Ludger mentioned yesterday, as a blockchain, kind of as a new social contract perhaps, or as a new, as it was phrased, maybe spectral solidarity of some sort. Or this as a universal. But what do you mean by universal? Computational universal?
I mean something which is almost equivalent to an atoms or to an electrons in physics. Even if we know that with elementary particles we always have smaller and smaller elements. But I mean something which is an equivalent, more powerful than, for example, money. Because money is an equivalent, is a universal equivalent for the exchange of goods, as Marx spoke about, etc. And it's the great abstract equivalent, which is true. But it's not universal in the sense that if I put a couple of coins here, it's not going to do any calculation. I need to add arithmetic on top of that. It's in itself, it's nothing. While what is happening in a computer, it is computation. You see what I mean? It's already it's self-sufficient. This is what I mean by universal. I mean something which by itself and in itself has the capabilities of being effective. And effective in the way that it's computing, that it's making computation. That this is what I mean by universal, and for me, the Turing machine is for the first time in history something which is truly universal.
The computational potential in some way, as a shared computational potential of new contingency.
Yes, because it can compute. Again, if I take money, I need to add a layer of knowledge on top of the money. In itself, if I take gold, small, a couple of coins made of gold. If I give this to a primitive civilization, to primitive guys who don't know anything about gold and who don't know anything about computation, it will do nothing. It will be nothing. It's just raw material. A computer is not a raw material. A computer is already something which is organized and which is intelligent. And what happens in a computer, thanks to Turing, is something which is already effective. The Turing machine is abstract, but it has its own effectivity. Money is abstract, but in a sense it does not have its own effectivity. There's no calculus, there's no computation, there's no rules for making computation, which is embedded into a bill or into a coin.
But yes, it's the number, the computable numbers. It's a particular definition of what numbers are. That's the precondition for the Turing machine to be universal. So it's a definition, a restriction of the universe of the different numbers into one set, which lends itself for rational
the Turing machine has its own rule. You agree? It has its own rule.
Of course. And not only the rules, but its own particles, so its own particular number class.
Yeah, but this is what I mean. It's very peculiar to the Turing machine. There's no other tool in society which has its own rules, which are universally applicable.
The market, maybe.
Maybe the market.
You start exchanging and you know that the price is going to go up. You have the rule, that's it. It's as simple as that.
Okay, I think we can go further. Let's have a short break, 15 minutes, 10 minutes, and come back. Thank you.